Alright, in this video we're going to talk about how we interpret graphs when we see graphs relating to quantities, and how we can attach real-world style meaning to the information that we see in a graph. I'm going to use this graph off to the top right, which is a graph of a line that represents the number of pets that can be purchased for $40 at a pet store, and you can see the graph, and the axes are labeled and numbered so that they'll be easy for us to read. Let's look at the primary features of the graph that we will be looking for and using in interpretation type questions. There are four primary things that we can look for from a linear graph. The first of these is the x-intercept, and the x-intercept is where the graph crosses the x-axis. That's that point right there. And anytime we have an x-intercept, it shows us what the value of x is when y is 0. Okay? Now, in this graph, our y variable represents the number of hamsters, and our x variable represents the number of goldfish that can be purchased. And so this x-intercept shows us how many goldfish we can buy if we don't buy any hamsters. And we can read very clearly from the graph that it crosses at 8. And so we can buy 8 goldfish if we don't buy any hamsters. And that's the meaning of the x-intercept in this graph. Alright, next, we have the y-intercept, which is where the graph crosses the y-axis. So right here. That shows us the value of y when x is 0. So in this graph, it's showing us the number of hamsters if we buy 0 goldfish. And we see that that number is 4, and so a real-world interpretation of this is if we don't buy any goldfish, then we can buy 4 hamsters. Then there are other easily readable points on the graph. For instance, this point right here, that will give us various other combinations of the number of goldfish and hamsters I can purchase. And I can just read off their coordinates. If you look at this one, you see that this point has an x coordinate of 4 and a y coordinate of 2. So that's the point 4, 2. And if I want to assign a real-world meaning to that, that tells us that one of the possibilities for what we can purchase is we could purchase 4 goldfish and 2 hamsters. That's a possible combination of pets that we could purchase for $40, as well as the intercepts that we already found. And any point that we find on this graph that makes reasonable sense, we can interpret in that way. For instance, the point 6, 1 is on the graph, so we could buy 6 goldfish and 1 hamster. The point 2, 3 is on the graph, so we could buy 2 goldfish and 3 hamsters. There are some points that we can read off the graph that don't make sense in the context of the problem. For instance, the point 1, 3.5. I could buy 1 goldfish and 3.5 hamsters, but we can't really buy 3.5 hamsters, so that's not really a valid real-world point on this graph. Okay, and the fourth characteristic for interpretation is the slope. The slope shows how quickly the variables change in relation to one another, and we can interpret those as a type of change. So for instance, if I'm finding slope, I'm looking at 2 points, and so if I find the slope of this segment here, if we go down 1, we go over 2 to the right. And how I can interpret that from a real-world meaning standpoint is for every 1 less hamster we buy, since we went down 1, we can buy 2 more goldfish. And that's a real-world interpretation of the slope in this context. Another way to think about it is that 2 goldfish cost the same as 1 hamster. That's something we can tell from the graph, since if we buy 1 more hamster, we have to buy 2 less goldfish, and vice versa. That gives us an interpretation for the slope in a real-world context. All right, one more example. We're going to look at a double graph here. In this graph, we've got the profits and expenses for a particular company a certain number of months after they opened up. We've got the number of months along the horizontal axis and their profit and expense in hundreds of thousands of dollars along the y-axis. And we can interpret these graphs. The first question, we're just going to go through and answer these 5 questions. The first graph, what does the y-intercept of the expenses graph tell us? Well, the expenses graph is the red graph here. Its y-intercept is right here. And what does it tell us? It tells us the expenses that the company had when they opened up. And we can see that that's at a y value of 2, which in this case represents $200,000. And so the expenses for the company were $200,000 when they opened up. And they opened. Okay. Second question. What does the slope of the profit graph tell us? So now we're looking at the blue graph. And if we look at the slope of this graph, we go up 1 and over 1 as we go from one point to the next. And so the profits are going up by $100,000 every month in the future. And that's what the slope tells us. Profits are increasing at a rate of $100,000 a month. Okay, question 3. What does the point 3, 4 on the expenses graph tell us? Okay, that represents 3 months and $400,000. And so the company's expenses after 3 months were $400,000. And then our next question. What does the 0.99 on the profit graph tell us? There's the 0.99. And it tells us that the company's profits were $900,000 after 9 months. And the last question, after how many months does this company's profit begin to exceed their expenses? So we're looking here, if we start at the left-hand side of the graph and look at the graph, the red graph is above the blue graph. And so over here all the way on the left, the expenses are greater than the profit. And as we move from left to right, the profit graph rises a little more quickly than the expenses graph. And we hit this point right here where the 2 graphs cross. And that's where the profit is going to start exceeding the expenses. And if we look at where that happens, that's after 6 months. And so 6 months is our answer to that question. So that's a little bit about how we interpret and read graphs to answer real-world type questions from the information and some of the key characteristics that we can use from graphs. All right, that concludes this video. See you next time.